In this video, I want to share with you the 30 mixing tips that have had the biggest impact on my mixing career over the past 25 years. I can almost directly attribute each step of my career as being intrinsically linked to each of these tips, and they haven't helped only me. Our accelerator students use these tips to get signed to their favorite labels, get tens of millions of streams on Spotify, and even become full-time music producers and mixing engineers. Now, some of these tips are more of a philosophical framework for mixing, others are specific tactics, and I'm going to share some of my best workflow tips as well. So let's dig into it, but before you do, you can download my free mixing checklist below this video, which is going to give you a step-by-step guide to making sure your mix is ready for release. So without further ado, let's get the headphones on and start mixing. In fact, that takes me to my first point. I just used to use really cheap headphones, and when I invested £120 in a half-decent pair of Sennheisers, I won my first remix competition, got my first manager, and everything started to change for me. Now, I'm not saying that this is the be-all and end-all of mixing, but if you can't hear what you're mixing accurately, how do you know what your moves are doing? Once you've got a good pair of headphones or monitors, listen to a lot of the kind of music that you really like on it, and the kind of music that you want to mix. For anyone who wants to put recommendations in the comments, please do. Okay, so now we can hear what we're doing. The next tip is something that I struggled over for years before I truly understood this. And I see producers and mixers making this mistake time and time again. Think of it like this. If you were a chef and you started out with poor quality, rotten ingredients, that end meal that you create is never going to be delicious. So if you spend 80 to 90% of the time focused on choosing the right sounds, then the mixing is way easier. So how do you pick the right sounds? Well, if you're producing rock music, the work's already been done for you, because guitars, vocals, a bass guitar and drums, much like an orchestra, are designed to work together frequency-wise. Whereas if you were just to have 4 different guitars playing together, those frequencies are all going to be mixing and fighting with each other. Now I'm going to show you how I do this in the DAW, so let's jump in. In this example, I'm starting with a vocal that I'm doing a remix for, and I need to find sounds that are going to work with this. So first thing is I pick sounds that I know are kind of along the right path just by scrolling through my different samples in my sample packs, which I have organized into favorites. This makes working way quicker. And here's the important part. Once I've got those sounds initially programmed in like this, I will swap out the sounds one by one whilst the track is playing. So if I want to find a good clap sample, I'll listen to the track whilst I preview different clap sounds. So I've hit the hot swap button, I can press play, and then I'll just preview some. And when I find one that I like, I just write it down on a simple post-it note like that. And I will do that for 5 or 6 sounds that I think work well, and then I will A/B test each of those sounds in the list against each other, crossing out the one I like least each time until I end up with what I think is the best sound. Now, how did I know which sounds to pick? I used reference tracks, which is my next tip. If there's only one tip you take from this video, let this be it. You can actually use reference tracks for every part of the production process, but I want to just focus on mixing today, so here's how you do it. The first thing to do is create an audio channel in your DAW. Then you can drag in your reference track from wherever you've downloaded it. Ideally, you want a high quality file like a WAV or an AIFF. Once you drag it into your audio channel, there are a couple of plugins that I like to use. The first is a gain plugin, which I reduce the volume by 12 decibels. This is because our reference track has already been mastered, so it's going to sound much louder than the track we're trying to mix. By reducing it by 12 decibels, it doesn't counteract the mastering, but it does make it so that when we've got our balanced mix, we should be able to get it sound similarly loud without clipping on the master channel. And more on that in a couple of minutes. The next thing I like to put on is a spectrum analyzer. I'm using Voxengo Span, which is a free plugin, and then on the master channel of our mix, I put another spectrum analyzer as well, like this. And if you're wondering how I open up 2 together, in Ableton's preferences, you just go to the plugins section and then make sure that you've got multiple plugin windows switched on. And now this reference track can act as a guide for our mix. For this example, I'm using one of our accelerator students' tracks, Merly, which is quite cool that I'm actually referencing one of our students' music. But Merly makes great music, and now she's actually touring the world with her favorite DJs. And here's our track. So I just want to make sure that we've got a similar frequency spread to the reference track. super useful. Another reason that we use reference tracks is because if you're anything like me, if you've been listening to a loop for half an hour, 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, you start to lose objectivity and get sick of it. And that takes me on to my next tip, which is mix as quickly as you can. As I've already mentioned, we lose objectivity if we listen to something over and over again. So by using something like a reference track to help you mix quicker, you can help avoid that ear fatigue. I also prefer to mix in the mornings. And my next tip, which is simply to take breaks often. If I've been sat down for an hour or two mixing, I'm going to take a break, go for a walk, or listen to some other music just to try and reset my ears. The next tip is going to help you mix even faster. Not only that, it's going to save you from that overwhelm of when you've got 80 or 90 different tracks in a project and you simply don't know what to mix first. Do you tweak the kick drum? Do you tweak the vocals? It can be very overwhelming. So something that absolutely changed the game for me was to use what I call the top-down mixing approach. Now, I've since been told that actually means something specific, but I invented it for me, so I'm going to keep using it. What it basically means is you mix the most important element of your track first, and you adhere to this hierarchy. So, in dance music, for instance, that would be the kick drum, then I'd bring in the bass line, I get those two things working well together, then I'd bring in the rest of the drums, or maybe the main vocal or lead synth, and at each stage, I'm not bringing in the next thing until I've got those core elements working together first. There's simply no point. What I see is a lot of people will spend ages EQing a background pad before they've even got their kick and bass sounding good together. But this takes me on to my next tip, which is how do you know what part of the track to start mixing first? Well, here's what I recommend. Mix the main, drop, or chorus. That is the main 4, 8, or 16 bars of the track where the most things are happening. This is because once you've got that part of the mix working well, it's going to be the most energetic part of the entire song. A problem I see producers making is having a really strong, powerful build-up, but then they've already used all the energy in the headroom that we've got available. So if we start with the main drop or chorus, we know that's the maximum energy of the track, so we just have to work up to that or down from that for the verses, the breaks, and the builds. Now, my next tip can help you determine where those points are, and that's to use your reference track, but create what I call an energy map. Here's how you do it. You simply create another audio or MIDI channel below your reference track, put on yet another gain plugin, and then we map out the energy of that reference track using automation. Now, we're never actually going to hear this is just a visual guide. So I'm going to get to the busiest and loudest part of the entire track, which is usually going to be the second or third drop or chorus, and I'm going to set that to be the point with the most energy, like here. Oh, lovely. And then I would just listen to the track and map out the energy as it ebbs and flows to use as a guide. So we can see here, the energy kind of dies out at the end. We've got a build up there that might go to that point, and we've got our break. The energy really drops down there, but at this point it's higher. And then at that point, it's obviously high as well. And I would do this whilst listening to the music. And then I can use that as a visual guide for where we want our mix to be the loudest and have the most energy. Now, this next tip is an absolute game changer. I've seen some opinions online that oppose this, but I'm just going on my experience and what's helped our students accrue over 100 million streams. Think of the best logos in the world. They work in black and white as well as color. So we want our mix to work in mono as well as in stereo. And the reason being, sometimes people will be listening to it on a phone with mono speakers or from another room. So it's coming to them as really a mono signal rather than stereo. But more importantly than that, it just makes our job of mixing easier. When we sum everything to mono, we're taking that stereo information out of the picture. So then we can focus just on relative levels, which is about 90% of a good mix, and how it's working in terms of dynamics and frequencies. Personally, my ears are pretty stupid, so I want to break things down and make it as simple as possible for them. And having that mono switch that I can check every few minutes has really helped both me and my students. All DAWs have got some kind of plugin where you can switch the signal to mono. In Ableton, it's the utility. So I put one on my master channel like this. I hit the keyboard shortcut button, I hit the mono button, choose a simple shortcut. For me, it's just M. And then whenever I hit it, it's gonna convert our mix to mono. And I'll use that every few minutes just to check my mix is still working. Now you'll note I didn't just throw that plugin on randomly, there was a reason behind it, which takes me on to my next tip. If you're anything like me, you probably have hundreds of plugins on your hard drive and you don't know what to use and in what order. A key framework when it comes to mixing is to have an intention, rather than just throwing things on randomly. So always ask yourself, what are you trying to achieve? Why are you trying to achieve it? And then, and only then, do you ask, how do I achieve it? And that takes me to my next tip. Way back in the 90s, I learned to mix on a piece of software called Propellerhead's Reason. Now, at the time, you couldn't use third-party plugins, so I could only use the stock plugins that came with the software. Now, the benefit of this was I really got to know them inside out. I learned what every single plugin did. I didn't get overwhelmed by having 50 different third-party EQs on my hard drive. So, before you start investing in expensive plugins, really get to know the stock plugins that come with your DAW. Restrictions breed creativity, and they just take away so much of the overwhelm. Okay, so how do you know which settings to use in each plugin? Well, what I like to do is to use the dry and wet control and push that plugin way harder than I'm going to finally need it, so I can hear the settings before dialing it back to the sweet spot. For example, rather than having a tiny bit of reverb, I'm going to push it quite hard so I can really hear how long that reverb tail is, what the pre-delay is doing, what the EQ is doing on that reverb, and I've got a power tip for reverb in a couple of minutes. Then, and only then, will I dial back that dry wet control and get that reverb working nicely with the dry signal. This works for distortion, saturation, reverb, delay, any effect. If you push it hard, you can get the settings right and then dial it back to the sweet spot. But you've got to check your moves. Every part of the mixing process should be improving the sound, and that can be a hard thing to gauge. Here's why, and here's how you can get around it. So when we add plugins and make moves on a particular sound, we're usually either increasing or decreasing the volume as well. For example, let's look at our vocal track here.
Close my eyes, I count to 10, I miss you.
If we add these plugins,
Close my eyes, I count to 10, I miss you.
we can see the volume's actually increased, and louder sounds generally sound better to our ears. Now, the way to get around this problem and give yourself a real fair test of what your mixing moves are doing is make sure that after each plugin, you're adjusting the volume so it's about the same as before it goes into the plugin. Now, in this instance, these plugins increased that volume by about 2 decibels. So all I'm going to do is on the last plugin, take it down by 2 decibels. And now we should be able to A/B test them in a fair manner.
Close my eyes, I count to 10, I miss you. Tell me again, why didn't I follow you?
And I'll listen to that in the context of the track,
Close my eyes, I count
without the
to 10, I
plugins,
miss you.
and with the plugins.
Close my eyes, I count to 10, I miss you.
So what I'll usually do at that point is close my eyes and just turn them on and off a few times so I don't know whether it's on or off. And then I'll press play,
Close my eyes, I count to 10, I miss you.
press the button,
Tell me again, why did
and decide whether I think it sounds better, and then look at the screen. Oh, they're on. So that's how I know that the mixing move made it better, not just louder. This is a form of what's known as gain staging, which is my next tip. Now, people obsess about this. You really don't have to. All it is paying attention to the level of the signal throughout the entire chain to avoid having unwanted clipping and therefore distortion, and to make sure, as I've just shown, that we can hear what moves we're doing more accurately. And the final thing, which is a bit more advanced, is that when we're using analog modeled plugin, if you push that signal in too hot, you're going to lose a bit of control over what's happening within the plugin. Here's a quick example. At the moment, I've got this signal going in, and we can see it's being affected by the saturator, but the drive is down at 0. So I'm going to turn the volume down before it goes into that plugin, so then all the control can come from this drive knob. Right, we're halfway through, so now let's get on to some really technical stuff. This next step will help you set up your mix so you're not going to run into any clipping issues on the master channel, and that is anchor your kick drum at -12 decibels peak. That means the loudest point of that kick drum is hitting -12 decibels. Then I leave my master fader set to 0, which means a balanced mix is probably going to be peaking at about -6 decibels on our master fader, which is perfect for going into the mastering stage. Once that kick is anchored at -12 decibels, I leave it alone and I mix everything to work around that kick. And using my top-down mixing approach, the next most important aspect is going to be the bass. My friend Jolyon Petch, who's got well over 100 million streams on Spotify, said this was a game changer tip for him when he learnt it from one of my lessons. So here's how I treat bass. I separate it into the sub bass and any other basses as mid bass. This is so I can balance the sub bass and the mid bass independently, which gives way more control over the overall mix. So in the example we were just looking at, we've got our bass track like this, which is just actually an audio sample. I'm going to duplicate that. I'm going to have one called sub bass. And what we're going to do is just take out everything above about 100 hertz. So it's basically just the fundamental of the bass. For the second track, which is now our mid bass, I'm going to do the exact opposite and roll everything off above 100 hertz. So it sounds like this. So now I can balance the sub against the mid. What if you've got multiple different bass instruments? Well, what I found works really well is if just one thing is handling the sub bass at any one time. So that might be your kick drum, and then your sub bass, and then your kick drum, and then your sub bass. And any of your mid basses have been rolled off at about 100 or 120 hertz to make sure that you don't end up with a really cluttered, muddy low end. No one wants that. So what level should your bass be at? And this is something I found out fairly recently. If your kick drum is peaking at -12 dB, if you get your sub bass to be averaging about -20 dB, I found that works really well as a balance between your kick and your bass. Then you can just bring in the mid bass over the top of that to sound good with the sub. I found that that little tip has made it way easier for our students who haven't been producing for very long, so their ears can really do with that visual guide and that figurative amount. Of course, as with any mixing, use your ears, and there are going to be exceptions to this, but I found it works in about 95% of cases. And as I said, if you want a step-by-step mixing checklist, don't forget to download my brand new one below this video. So, tip number 19, and we've already touched upon this with the mid basses. As I said, we don't want to have a muddy low end because those waves are really big in the bass frequencies. So what I've found is that you can roll off pretty much everything apart from the kick and the sub bass at roughly 100 hertz, but really as high as you can go without affecting the sound adversely. Apart from the kick and the sub bass, there are a couple more exceptions to this, usually male vocals, which you can usually roll off at 70 or 80 hertz, and low percussion like tom drums, which again, you don't want to roll off everything under 100. But here's an example of what I mean. If we've got this open hat, you can see there are all these frequencies down here that you can't hear. They're completely useless. So we can roll them off, and it's just going to make our mix cleaner. Especially if you're doing that on everything that doesn't need those low frequencies. Now, if you remember a couple of minutes ago, I said only one thing should be handling the sub bass at any time. But how can you do that if your kick and your bass is playing simultaneously? This is a tip that I'm sure a lot of you already know, but it's worth touching upon because it's so impactful and really was one of the biggest things that took my music from sounding amateur to sounding professional. And that is to use sidechain compression or volume shaping to duck certain sounds against the kick drum. This is ubiquitous in all sorts of music today, and here's how you do it. Now remember, we only want one thing handling the sub bass at any one time, and at the moment our bass sounds like this. And you can see I've got the sub bass separate from the mid basses where they're rolled off. Lovely. However, the kick drum also has sub bass, so at the moment it sounds like this. And actually, that sub bass is really fighting with the kick drum. So for sidechain compression, all you need to do is group the basses together, or just put it on whichever channel you want not to fight with the kick, put a normal compressor on that channel, hit sidechain mode like this. You might have to open up that little button there. And then I take the audio from my SC trigger track. Now, I use a really short, sharp little rim shot sound that sounds like this. And the reason I use that instead of taking the signal from the kick drum is because I want all the control to be on this sidechain compressor with the attack and the release, so I can get it pumping against the kick drum in the way that I want. If you take the input from the kick drum, you're really restricted on the shape of the pumping effect. So I'm going to set that sidechain trigger track to be sends only, so we never actually hear that tick. It's just going to be used to trigger our sidechain compressors, and then we've got this effect when we turn it on. So at the moment our bass is doing this. Now let's bring the threshold down of the compressor. And we can hear it's now bouncing. We've got a really fast attack. And then I time the release to go with the tempo of the track. So now with our kick drum, we've got this effect instead of this. Loads of space and sounds really punchy. Okay, now let's get into the nitty-gritty. One of the problems that I used to suffer from was that even if I've got the relative levels sounding good together, quite often the sounds don't really sound like they're gelled together or coming from one place. There's a few tips on how to help, the first of which is using glue compression. Now you can use this at the group level, or you can use it on the master channel, or you can use it on both. But I've found what works well with glue compression is just a gentle amount that just ties everything together. So let's have a listen to it on this drum group, and I'll show you the settings I like to use. So I've dragged the glue compressor there, which is really modeled on the SSL compressor, and you can get one of those from Waves. Now the difference between this and a normal compressor is that you've got a little less control, and it's generally used to create a warmer, more analog feeling. Now I'm going to dial in these settings a bit hard, as we touched upon earlier, so I can really show you what's happening. So let's bring the threshold down. so we can hear the compression. And then I'm going to set my attack to 30 milliseconds to allow the kick to pop through a bit more. So let's push it harder and really hear the difference. So this is where we were. And now we've got that kick pumping. And then with the release, depends on the tempo of the track. I usually leave it on 0.6 or maybe take it down a little bit more so it releases quicker. And then you can have the ratio on either 2 or 4. I usually leave it on 4. And then what I'm looking for is about 2 to 3 decibels of gain reduction, and that's all. Just to gel everything together. And then the makeup gain by the same amount we've just reduced it by. So now we've got this effect. We go from that to this. It just compresses all the drums together and makes them sound a little bit more cohesive. Now, an alternative to grouping your drums together is what changed my low ends from sounding a bit loose and flabby to really tight and solid that really sounds great on any system. And I can directly attribute it to my tracks jumping up to the next level and actually getting signed and released. And that's when I started getting paid for making music. And that is to use a kick and bass bus. This simply means I send the kick and the bass into one group and then process them together as one signal. Now I can use a glue compressor for that, and I can also use my next mixing tip, which is how Skrillex gets his music sounding so loud. This is something you should be very careful with, and it's only to be done really towards the end of a mix, but here's how you do it. So we've got our bass and our kick routed into this kick and bass bus, and at the moment we can see that we're hitting about -10 decibels peak. Now, if I use the glue compressor, as I've just shown you, with similar settings, to gel it all together a little bit more, very subtle. And then I'm going to use a clipper or a limiter, and I'm looking for only 1 to 2 decibels of gain reduction here. We can see we're just taking off those transient peaks, and now we've got something that sounds just as loud as it did, maybe even a little bit louder, but we've got 2 decibels extra of headroom because we're only peaking at -12 instead of -10. And that's how you can get a rock solid low end. Okay, let's rewind because we've already got to groups, but I've got a few more tips that are useful earlier in the process than that. The first of which is how you're going to stop your vocals and synths getting washed out when you use reverb. And that is to use auxiliary channels for spatial effects like reverb and delay. There's a couple of reasons for that. The first of which is just you've got more control because then you can EQ and treat those wet signals as independent from the dry signal. Not only that, but when you use a reverb on the channel itself and you go from dry to wet, as you do that mix, the dry signal will reduce in volume whilst the wet signal increases in volume. When using spatial effects on an auxiliary channel, your dry signal is going to stay the same, and then you just feed out a little bit of that signal to a spatial effect that's set to 100% wet. If we look at the previous example of feeding out some of that vocal to an auxiliary channel reverb, we've got this kind of effect.
You were far mystery. It was all that I could see.
And the vocal's kind of getting lost in the reverb. So here's what you can do with next level sidechain compression. We're going to bring a compressor after that auxiliary reverb, open up the sidechain panel, except we're going to take the audio input from that dry vocal this time, instead of the sidechain trigger. So let's take it from the vocal. I'm going to have quite quick attack and release settings, and what we want to do is duck this reverb signal when the dry signal is singing. When the dry vocal stops singing, that reverb fills out the space in between the words. So a really extreme version would be this.
You were far a mystery. It was all that I could see. We could have stayed.
But that's too extreme. So we want it to be more subtle than that altogether.
You were far. It was all that I could see.
And it just allows that vocal or lead synth to really pop through the mix. Now, even if you've been finding these mixing tips useful, there are probably still a few mistakes that you're making which will ruin all of this, so we'll touch upon them in a few minutes. Oh, I actually wanted to tell you about something. If you set up an auxiliary channel at the beginning of your mix called room reverb, and you just have a very short reverb with a decay of about under half a second, you can then feed separate elements out to that reverb. That is the difference between having something that sounds really dry and disparate to having something that really sounds like it's in a real place. Here's an example with the drums. So I've created this auxiliary channel called room reverb. I've put a normal reverb on there with a decay of under 500 milliseconds. I put it to 100% wet because it's an auxiliary channel. We don't want to be doubling up the dry signal. Then I've just boosted the volume a bit by 10 decibels because the reverbs on Ableton kind of make it quiet. And then I've taken everything out from 120 hertz downwards because we don't want reverb in the low end. That's going to muddy the mix as well. Now let's start feeding some of these separate drums and this drum loop out to that room reverb. So within a drum rack in Ableton, at least, if you open up this routing, you can right click and then create return chain and just select that room reverb that you've created from the drop down menu. Then you can hide that again, and then you have these separate send controls for each drum, and that allows you to feed a little bit of each drum out to that room reverb. So here's the difference. This is without the room reverb turned on, and then we're going to turn it on halfway through this loop. Sounds good, but really dry. Now check this out. And that just really makes things stick together and sound like they're coming from one place. So these last 4 tips are more workflow, but when you implement them, your mixes will instantly sound better, your ears are going to thank you, and you're going to be able to mix way quicker. Now, quite often when students first come to us, they're pushing everything too hot because they want it to sound loud. But if you anchor the kick at -12 dB, as we looked at before, you should be okay. You can always turn the volume up on your monitoring if you want it to sound louder, but by mixing at a low volume, it's going to be easier to get the balance of sounds right. That's because, as we touched upon earlier, if you're mixing at a loud volume, it all sounds loud, so it sounds better to your ears, and it can be a bit misleading. But the next tip of turning it really low is how you can check that the core elements are all in balance. What I like to do is take the volume right down, and if I can hear the 4 core elements, that is the kick, the bass, the vocal or lead, and the main clap or snare, and they sound balanced at a low volume, that to me is a good sign. I then occasionally turn up the mix loud to make sure it's still working at louder levels, but try that really low mixing technique until you can barely hear it, and you'd be surprised at how much it helps. And that takes us on to the final 2. How many times have you taken a mix that sounds great in your headphones or monitors to your car or on your phone, and suddenly it sounds absolutely terrible? I know you've done that, because 100% of producers have done that. Now, this is a painstaking thing to do, but when I was mixing and mastering for different record labels every single day of the week, I had to do it. I would bounce out my finished track and listen to it on multiple systems. Then you can hear if something's missing in the mix on one system where it's showing on another. And it teaches you to use other techniques like adding more upper harmonics in your mid bass so it can be heard on smaller speakers, for example. But the only way you can really do this properly is to listen to your reference tracks on those different systems as well, and hear what the differences are. Now, you can use this plugin called Mix Checker Pro, which makes this way quicker and way faster. You just throw it on your master channel, and then you can use these different algorithms to check how your mix is likely to sound on these different systems. Remember though, you always have to check your reference track to that same system to hear what the differences are. Finally, how can you get good at mixing? You just do it a lot. Now, if you also mix for other people, that's going to really improve your skills because you're having to objectively listen to something someone else has produced. That's exactly what we do in the accelerator, but you can actually get paid for doing that if you use websites like Fiverr, Upwork, or Sound Better. Post some examples of mixes that you've already done, and then get paid to mix other people's music and improve your mixing skills. Now, you could implement all of these tips I've just shown you, but there are 8 things that if you're still doing them, they're going to ruin your mix no matter how many of these tips you implement. So I've put the 8 biggest mixing mistakes I see producers making in this video here, and once you know what they are, you'll be able to avoid them and create the perfect mix. To help with that, don't forget to download my mixing checklist below this video, and if you found this video useful, please give it a like, share, and consider subscribing to my channel. I'll catch you over at that next video where we're going to fix your mixing mistakes once and for all.